First Peter chapter 3, otherwise known as Love and Marriage, Love and Marriage, go together like a horse and carriage. If you want to be in trouble. All you got to do is follow the bouncing ball, Ken. I'm good. We get rid of them all? Hot dog. Good. Good, good, good. Wonderful. First Peter chapter 3. This was the passage that when I was a boy that got my pastor fired. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. There's a challenge when it comes to marriage, right? Marriage. I started a wedding that way once. Marriage is what brings us together today. Love, true love. I was in Kansas. I wasn't in West Virginia. I would have had to twang it. Yeah. But yes. Oh my goodness. We live in a world that is more and more seeing the whole idea of marriage go up in smoke. Not just because people aren't getting married or are dissolving marriages, but now, thanks to the courts, we have redefined marriage. And it's just a turkey shoot in so many different ways. And we want to bear in mind what God's Word says about these things. So, in context, of course, chapter 1, chapter 2, we've talked about the supremacy of Christ. We've talked about who we are in Christ. And as such, dealing with persecution and dealing with unfair treatment, there are a variety of scenarios in how we are to respond in different settings. And one of those settings has to do with marriage. When people get married in our part of the world, it usually is because somebody looks at somebody else and says, oh, he or she is so fine, and I want to get to know that person. And, it's like the ostrich that sets the plume up and tries to impress the lady ostrich, and before you know it, it's a done deal kind of a thing. In other parts of the world, at least half of the world, marriages are arranged by parents. And it's not so much the beautiful thing about whom should I marry, but rather what kind of marriage are we going to construct together that mother and father have concocted for one reason or another. And so tucked away here in this wonderful little letter is this gem dealing with a scriptural context of marriage. And these are challenging things. Circumstances that we've looked at in chapter 2. We've seen citizens that are being challenged by way of persecution in various situations. We've seen slaves being challenged by unjust masters. Now, we're going to look at wives who are being challenged by unjust husbands. And then we will look at Christians in an unchristian society later after that. So this key word here in verse 1, be subject or submit, to a lot of ladies is like fingernails on a chalkboard. Submit, submit, submit. That's what got my pastor fired. His idea of submission, now keep in mind, this poor guy was green behind the ears. He'd come fresh out of Bible school. This was probably 40 years ago, and that's just how it was. He presented things in such a manner that if you didn't get it, he would present it again and again and again and again and again. And I can't tell you how many weeks he preached on wives, submit to your husbands, wives, submit to your husbands, wives, submit to your husbands. He did this in a large degree because at that time, our church board, now I grew up in a little Baptist church, so we had deacons and trustees. We didn't have deacons and elders. So deacons in a Baptist church function as elders, and trustees function as deacons. And it's just a weird thing, but being a trustee opens the door for women to serve on the church board. And he was very anti that. My aunt was the treasurer, my grandmother was the clerk, my mother was a trustee, and there was another lady who was a trustee. And if it hadn't been for the ladies, the church would have closed because there just weren't enough men. And there are those situations where that's just the way it is. But he came in and he was going to change the world, and unfortunately nobody told him to slow down. And so this is, this was his swan song when it came to all that. But this word submit or to be subject to your own husbands is something that we have already defined when we looked at chapter 2. And we saw that it had to do with being a military term used in the Greek army. And it meant to fall in rank under the authority of another. Okay? To subject oneself for the purpose of obeying or pleasing another. And unfortunately, my pastor at that time included, there have been a number of people who have taken that whole concept of submit or be subject to the extreme in marriage. Was never meant to be an extreme thing at all. They take it to the extreme in the sense that it promotes cowering and a servant relationship behavior by women in the face of the worst possible kind of abuse. I remember we had a lady who was an aide at the Christian school that I attended in my later high school years. And she was in an abusive marriage, unfortunately. And she went to the pastor of the school, who was over at the school, and began talking to him about these things. And he told her that she had no right to leave her husband, that she was to stay with her husband. And he used this passage to justify those things. She ended up leaving her husband. She ended up losing her position at the school. and moved on with her life. And I mean, she's very happy now, but it was a sad, sad situation at the time. Um, there are others who have gone to the extreme opposite, and they would say that they apply these things only to the era in which it was written. This is what we call progressive theology, and this would be the examples of things that we have today, whereby it would be the same thing as where you read in Titus and in Timothy, where it says deacons and elders must be the husband of one wife. Well, that's what it applied to in that day. But today, women can be pastors and elders and deacons and all this other kind of stuff. And, that dog doesn't hunt, all right? It just doesn't work. But if you have that progressive mindset, that's how you excuse a lot of those things away. So we need to find a balance between those two extremes. So this is an interesting thing here. And these first 6 verses in chapter 3 refer to wives, and only one verse, verse 7, refers to husbands. And it seems that that would be rather strange. Why are the wives getting it in the neck more than the husbands? And I'll submit to you that it didn't have to do with the fact that wives needed to hear it longer and louder, but rather wives were the ones who were experiencing the persecution of unbelieving husbands. And so he was giving them that much more fodder for encouragement's sake and to help them endure those situations rather than pointing a finger at them. So this is without a doubt one of the hottest potatoes in Scripture. This whole idea of husbands and wives and the relationship with regards to the church and so forth, and especially for women. So let me put your mind at ease. I don't believe that you can take this one text of Scripture and isolate it to make it say that if you're in a bad relationship, you have to stay in that relationship. I don't see that anywhere. Anywhere. If a wife is in an abusive relationship where she and or her children are in danger, the smartest thing for you to do is get out. Get out. That doesn't necessarily mean you automatically file for divorce right away, but it means that you remove yourself from that situation and you put yourself under, hopefully, the protection of your church and the church leadership, and get yourself in a position of where you're going to be safe and where there can be some accountability come along and hopefully some counseling and so forth. It doesn't always end well. Sometimes it does. Most of the time it doesn't. But we're not going to say that based on this passage you're stuck. I don't get that, and I'll debate anybody about that. But there are 3 imperatives. There are 3 imperatives here that Peter gives to wives who are in an unhealthy situation, and it's very, very clear what those imperatives are. And lots of times, what happens is when wives look at this passage, they will view their role as a wife as being conditional. Because what they'll do is they'll tie in verse 7, and we will tie in verse 7 eventually, but they'll tie in verse 7 and they'll say, I will be the kind of wife that I should be when he becomes the kind of husband that he's supposed to be. because wives can't submit if husbands don't love. Now that's true, but that's not an excuse. Okay? Turnabout is fair play. The passage isn't just written to women who have husbands who play fair. It is written to people to wives who have husbands who don't play fair. It is written to wives who have husbands who are unbelievers. It is written to wives who are experiencing persecution from their husbands. So you can't say, well, I'll submit when he loves, because given the circumstances, it probably will never happen. So then what do? You at a celestial impasse? Not at all. A husband in that situation, an unbelieving husband, is going to just mock the things of God. And they're certainly not going to measure up to God's standards. So having to exhibit godly behavior under those circumstances can, and often does, cause wives to substitute secret manipulation for submission. Secret manipulation for a quiet spirit. Do you see it there? Let's look at it. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct. So a quiet spirit, that doesn't mean, a quiet spirit doesn't mean pouting. It doesn't mean sulking. It doesn't mean scheming or bargaining or nagging or preaching or coercing or humiliating. That's not what it means. Wives who use that type of strategy are not trusting God to change their husbands' lives. They're trusting themselves to do that. Because the truth is, wives, and this should be a good thing for all wives to hear, you are not responsible for your husband. You're not. God is. You are responsible for your own life. You cannot make your husband something that he is not. Only God can do that. Somebody asked Ruth Graham one time about that, and she said, "It's my job to love Billy. It's God's job to change him." That's pretty good philosophy. So, wives, it's your job to love your husband. It is God's job to change him. I would rather have your job than to have to think that you have God's job. And wives who are truly obedient to the Lord are going to find that the Lord is going to honor that spirit, that attitude. Because the truth is, submission, the way the Bible defines submission, submission is a mark of security. Submission is never to be seen as a spineless cringing that is based on insecurity and fear. It's never to be viewed that way. It is a voluntary unselfishness. It is a willing, cooperative spirit that seeks the highest good for your husband. There are always some who would say, well, you don't know my situation. You don't know the dead-end street that I live with. You don't know what a dirty, rotten, no good, ungodly person my husband is. No, but the Lord does. And notice what Peter goes on and says. He says, that they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives as they observe your respectful and pure conduct. Now, you may think I'm going to talk about being respectful and being pure, but I'm not. I'm going to talk about the term observe. Because that term observe suggests a very careful observation, not just a simple glance casually. A disobedient husband observes his wife's godly behavior. And as that happens, his heart is eventually going to soften towards spiritual things. That is what is often called the silent preaching of a godly wife. Now, ladies, if you've been married any length of time, you already know that silence can be very powerful. You already know that. You don't have to get into the knockdown, drag out argument kind of a thing. You can just kind of, and he gets it. He gets it. He knows he's in trouble. At least I know when I'm in trouble. This is what he's getting at here. Live the life before God. Well, I can't submit to my husband because my husband is this and this and this and this and this. Understand that. So if you can't submit to your husband, submit to the Lord. And thereby behave toward your husband as unto the Lord until such a time that you can do it for your husband. Because yes, unfortunately, we live in a world where there are some downright mean, rotten, scoundrel husbands who have no right even being a husband. And that's a tragedy. Notice the second thing that he says here. First of all, he says, I want you to analyze your actions. But then secondly, he says, I want you to watch your adornment and your attitude. Verse 3. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. Very precious. Okay? So what does that mean? Peter's drawing a contrast here between inner beauty and outer beauty, or as Peter puts it, outer adornment and inner adornment, verses 3 and verses 4. We live in a culture that is shop till you drop. And not only can you shop every conceivable item of clothing that there is in your home by way of the internet, but thankfully what keeps Eileen in a job is the hundreds, yea, thousands, yea, tens upon tens of thousands of junk mail flyers that comes into your home that she has to deliver on a daily basis. And anyone who's worth their salt who works for the post office will tell you that the post office exists because of junk mail. Right? How much it's beyond the hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah. Yeah. And so that's what keeps the post office going. It's not your 56-cent stamp or 60-cent stamp, whatever it is now. Um, but here's the thing. You know, I mean, you can order it on the internet day or night. And the point of the contrast that he's getting at here is to restore the balance. Again, extremism is not good in this situation. Peter is certainly not saying, don't fix the outward appearance. He's not saying that. I had a preacher one time who used to say, hey, if the barn needs painting, paint it. That really didn't go over real big. Don't say that. Making them sound like they're a barn. Well, braiding of hair, wearing of jewelry, he's not prohibiting that any more than he's prohibiting putting on dresses. No. He's simply saying those are the kinds of things that ought to be in the background while the character of the person should be in the foreground. It all ought to be perspective. Those are things that enhance. Now, as a general rule, I don't wear makeup. As a general rule. But if the barn needs painting, yeah, right. But I have learned from observing those who do that a proper application of makeup is to wear it in such a way that it looks like you're not wearing any. All right? It's meant to accent. It's not meant to make you the next Tammy Faye. Jim, did you know that they took all the makeup off of Tammy Faye and they found Jimmy Hoffa? That's old, but yeah, right. Perspective. Now, certainly taken to the unreasonable extreme, you can really miss the mark in all of this, because I have seen some women, unfortunately, who think that it is a mark of spirituality to go around looking like an unmade bed. That's not what he's getting at either. You know, there are some folks, and you would say, please use something. But again, we're talking about extremes, and Peter's trying to find balance in all of this. We can become preoccupied with our external appearances. We can begin judging ourselves solely by what the culture does. And Peter says, don't forget about the inner beauty that never fades. That is pleasing to God. The inner beauty is defined, he says, as a gentle and quiet spirit. You could paraphrase that and say a gentle tranquility. Without question, that is a woman's most powerful quality, her character. Her character. And that character comes from within. It does not come from what's on the outside. There are some lovely ladies on the outside who, because of their inner quality, are awful. And what they do on the outside doesn't even begin to cover up what's on the inside. You know, we don't want to focus on the one at the expense of the other. For the most part, I don't think it takes too long to put on makeup, does it? No? I mean, every once in a while you'll see someone who's doing it on their way to work in the morning. Right? I mean, that's talent on loan from God right there. But I've always wondered what happens if she hits a pothole. You know? There it goes. But anyway, I digress. Adornment. It's important, but it's not as important as attitude. And that's what Peter is getting at. If the internal attitude is right, it is amazing how much less the external appearance needs to be emphasized. Thirdly, he says, I want you to evaluate your attention. He continues in verse 5. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Now, the fact that Sarah called Abraham Lord reveals a lot about their relationship. What it basically means is that she respected her husband. She respected her husband. One of the books I've given out over the years for counseling issues more than any other is a book entitled Love and Respect. It is fantastic as far as describing the fact that husbands feel loved when they are respected by their wives. And of course, wives feel loved when they are loved by their husbands. And it defines all of that in the book. But what he's getting at is this idea of being attentive to his needs, cooperating with his wishes, adapting to his desires, all of that. The place where wives are supposed to put the majority of their attention, the majority of their efforts, is to their husbands. Now, granted, there are situations of where children come along. And there are needs that children just have to have met. But when push comes to shove, what he's getting at is, listen, you don't press for the constant needs of the children or the neighborhood or this or that or the other thing and put your husband's needs on hold. There needs to be priority in that. Part of raising children is getting them to the point where that they can be self-sufficient. My goodness, we have friends that when their kids were in high school and they were still cutting their meat for them. It's like, teach them to grow up. So a good paraphrase might be, Sarah paid attention to her husband. Now that doesn't mean, again, we're finding a happy medium here. We're not talking in extremes. You know, it's not the kind of thing where it's like, you know, he comes home, plops in the chair, you know, bring him the remote and the beer and the newspaper and send in the dog so he can pet the dog and then leave me alone the rest of the night. Let me know when supper's ready. You know, and that's ridiculous. But there is a matter of priority there. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. Now, I'm not suggesting that Sue and I, in all of our vast experience and wisdom, have it all together. But this is what we would do when the kids were little. And I would make the long journey, the half mile across the cornfield from the church to home. And I went around the cornfield, Mary. I didn't go through the cornfield. Just for clarification. I could see you picturing me coming through the stalks of corn, you know, like a movie or something, but it never worked out that way. But I would come home and I would open the door, and of course there's these two little girls. Daddy's home, Daddy's home. You know, and one on one leg, one on the other leg, and, you know, you pat them on the head and give them a kiss and all that kind of stuff and spend that 30 seconds with them. But then we would always say, all right, now, first, mommy daddy time. And you guys go off and find something to do. And they would. They'd go off and find something to do, and we'd go off in the other room and we would talk a little bit. if for no other reason than to let our children know that we were each other's priority and that they were not the center of the universe. And then, of course, we would go out and we would spend time with the kids and so forth. But that whole idea of the priority was something that you plant that at an early age. Sarah called him Lord. Basically, she paid attention to him. She paid attention to him. Now, those are three things for the ladies. Fellas, look at verse 7. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. I'm looking at the time, and we're going to tackle this next week, because I don't want to rush through it. Okay? Because I know you all need to beat the other churches to lunch. So far be it from me to prevent that from happening. That's right. Fellas, you'll get your beating next week. Okay? But look that over and see what, we know that less is more. And so it's all in one verse, but boy, what a verse. Verse 7. Okay? So we'll tackle that next week. All right. Off you go.